Okay, so phased approach to nuclear weapons abolition. And this will run about 25 minutes. This is my own work. I'm open to any constructive criticism to help improve it. It's I've probably given it half a dozen times now, but it changes every time. So here we go. Here's my creds. I quit college and got drafted in 1966. I enlisted in the Navy to avoid going to Vietnam. It turned out I was pretty good at what they were selling, and the Navy sent me back to college to finish an engineering degree, and I was commissioned as a line officer in 1973. Spent the rest of my career as a submarine officer. I commanded, I had almost every officer job in attack submarines. I was commissioned, or excuse me, I was in command at the end of the Cold War. And after that, spent another 7 years in senior level jobs, mostly in operations. I was involved with nuclear weapons throughout my career and was directly responsible for nuclear weapons on my ship when I was in command. I'm an engineer, physicist. I understand nuclear weapons and I understand their terrible destructive power. So that's kind of what brought me here. If I, knowing what I know, fail to oppose our national security strategy, then I'm complicit in it. And I can't live with that. So I went to ground zero. And I've spent the last 20 years there. And the wonderful people at ground zero took me in. It only took them maybe 15 years or so to start trusting me. But what I have seen in activism is an opposition to the national security strategy, an opposition to nuclear weapons, but that's not enough. And so I felt drawn to come up with a plan for the total elimination of nuclear weapons using existing treaties, cooperative negotiation with Russia and the other nuclear weapon states, and most of all, verification to achieve complete nuclear weapons elimination. It's really a simple process, and I'll break it down for you. Let's begin with an inventory of nuclear warheads in the world today. This comes from the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists Nuclear Notebook. It's freely available online. If you got the handout, there's a link to the nuclear notebook, and you can read the nuclear notebook for years and not get through it all. It's a compilation of a lot of material. As you can see, there's over 12,500 warheads in the world today. But more importantly, the US and Russia account for over 90% of them. That forms part of the methodology that I'm going to describe. The first column in the table, deployed warheads, are warheads that are mated to their launchers, either ballistic missiles or ICBMs, and they are stored both either sea-launched or intercontinental ballistic missiles, or they're at bomber bases in close proximity to the nuclear-capable aircraft. For the most part, they are essentially ready to launch on short notice. There's 1,000 warheads loaded in Trident submarines right now. There's 400 warheads on Minuteman III silos on Minuteman III missiles right now. And there's about 300 bombs at 2 bomber bases in the U.S. that are on alert. In 1986, there were over 70,000 warheads in the world. And that has dropped a lot since the end of the Cold War. But since 2010, the numbers haven't changed much. So it's time to renew our efforts to dismantle these nuclear weapons. 90% of the warheads are controlled by the U.S. and Russia. So the plan is to get the U.S. and Russia's stockpiles lowered before we expect the rest of the world to give up their weapons. The non-deployed warheads are stored separate from launchers and are not available for use on short notice. So what that means is you can get rid of those without changing the, quote, deterrent effect of having weapons deployed. Those numbers also include obsolete warheads that are maintained in storage bunkers that are waiting to be dismantled. And that's the first target. So you can see there's over 8,000 non-deployed warheads. And that's what we're going to start working on. Breaking those down, both the U.S. and Russia each have over 1,500 retired warheads. The U.S. warheads are under Department of Energy control near Albuquerque. The priority to dismantle those needs to be made, and they can be dismantled unilaterally without affecting anything. And it would reduce the U.S. stockpile by nearly 40% without changing the security strategy at all. In the 1990s, the U.S. dismantled over 1,000 warheads a year. In 2020, they dismantled 184, and the Biden administration has refused to disclose the numbers for 21 and 22, but I suspect they were very low. Russia has a comparable number and could do the same. Back in the 90s, the U.S. was paying Russia to dismantle warheads. It financed warhead dismantling in the former Soviet Union, including places like Ukraine and Georgia that gave up their nuclear weapons. If we had a cooperative agreement with Russia, those are the kinds of things that we could do. Looking at the next two columns, strategic reserve and tactical, it's obvious that the U.S. has a more strategic reserve. Russia has more tactical weapons, and it's going to take effective bilateral cooperation with Russia to move on getting those non-deployed warheads off the books. So how are we going to do that? Well, the way we're going to do that is to call on our government to renegotiate START, Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. Ukraine war has really screwed that up. But it's vital that those negotiations move forward. There is a cadre There still exists a cadre of arms control negotiators who were instrumental in putting together START or New START in 2010 on both sides. And while they are clearly agents of their government, they know what they're doing, as opposed to what Ray McGovern calls the sophomores that are currently running our national security policy. There are wise people in government who understand negotiation, but we got to be able to sit down and do it. And right now, it's being stonewalled because of the Ukraine war. But what I say is we should demand a new treaty that provides for a transition to a minimum deterrent strategy. It'll level the playing field with Russia and with China and the rest of the world. And until we get to that minimum deterrent level, we're not going to get into negotiations with the other nuclear weapon states. So the next New START, needs to address both the non-deployed warheads as well as the deployed. And I'll address what minimum deterrence is in a couple of slides. So New START's been around since 2010. The key word in the acronym is reduction. It's the only treaty we have with the Russians right now. And Putin announced a few weeks ago that he has suspended New START. That really didn't change anything since the verifications associated with New START, the intrusive on-site inspections, open skies agreements, and notifications of tests and weapon movements really kind of stopped during COVID. There has been, since the Ukraine war, opposition to starting them again. The U.S. has said we're open to restarting these verifications, and it's just a matter of time until that happens. We almost lost New START right at the beginning of the Biden administration. It was due to expire in February 2021, and the Trump administration had no intention of negotiating a new agreement, and they were going to let it expire in February 2021. After the inauguration in January, the Biden team got to Russia very quickly and managed to extend the treaty for 5 years. So we still have a treaty, but because of the Ukraine war, we're not doing the verifications that we need to do in order for New START to really work. Minimum deterrence, I introduced that as a term. It's transitional. We need to get down to a number that is politically acceptable while moving toward complete elimination. There's been a lot of studies. The numbers aren't really that important. What's important is policy. Minimum deterrence is retaliatory. It's a no first use. India and China have both adopted minimum deterrence strategies, and it just makes sense. There's a lot of analysts now that are saying China is moving away from no first use. I personally don't believe that. China does not have the capacity to project power to the continental United States right now, and is happy to, well, maybe they're happy to stay that way. I don't know what propaganda to listen to, but I don't believe that China has any aspirations of attacking the United States with nuclear weapons. But the other part of the policy is that minimum deterrence is not compatible with counterforce. Right now, we, the United States and the UK, are providing a nuclear umbrella for NATO, and in the case of the US, a nuclear umbrella for the Pacific allies of South Korea, Japan, and Australia. If we lower our stockpile to a minimum deterrent level, we cannot provide that umbrella to the allies. Hence, that motivates, or would motivate them to join the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which I think is ultimately where we're going to end up if we don't kill ourselves first. So how would the U.S. achieve a minimum deterrent? There's lots of formulas for reducing deployed weapons. In my mind, the Minuteman III, the intercontinental ballistic missiles, are dangerous. They are most vulnerable to a counterforce first strike. So there is tremendous urgency to use them on warning, launch on warning, which means if you think somebody is shooting weapons at you, get those out of the silos. And it's not like you can take them out and put them somewhere. The only way to get them out of the silos is to launch them. That's dangerous. They need to be decommissioned. There's 46 B-52 bombers. They can be decommissioned. I mean, they're years and years and years old. And then 6 of the 14 Tridents. And that gets you down to the number that I came up with of 500. What's more important is the replacement strategic weapon system funding. If the government says we're going to reduce our deployed nuclear weapons to a minimum deterrent, that obviates the need for the Columbia-class SSBN, obviates the need for the ground-based strategic deterrent, and obviates the need for the B-21 bomber programs. You're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars that would not go to the arms industry. And you can imagine what the arms industry is thinking about right now, if they're thinking that they have to protect their investment. They're the biggest enemy we have. It's not the Russians, it's the arms industry. I said earlier, New START does not apply to non-deployed warheads. The next iteration of START really has to. And the reason is if New START actually did expire 2 years ago, year and a half ago, what would have happened? Well, what would have happened is all of the strategic reserve warheads would have been available to be loaded on existing launchers. I said earlier, there's each missile on a Trident submarine will accommodate up to 8 warheads, but now there's 4 to 5. Well, if you do the math, that 1,000 W76-1 warheads, well, they just happen to fit on all of the empty spots on the Trident missiles. Similarly, there are 400 W78 warheads that are stored at Warren Air Force Base in Wyoming. The Minuteman III missiles can accommodate 3 warheads each. They currently have 1. And so those strategic reserve warheads could be easily uploaded onto the Minuteman missiles. So instead of having 1,550 deployed warheads, we'd be up over 3,000. It is necessary to have some non-deployed warheads, and because of the nature of shipyard maintenance, all of the warheads are removed from a submarine before it goes to the shipyard. And where do those go? Those go into storage. Same thing on the Russian side. So I came up with a number of 150 reserve warheads that allows for normal maintenance and rotation of the launcher platforms. So what we end up with here is 650 total warheads for the US and Russia. China has about 350 now. Is actually China's up to 410 by the latest estimate from the Nuclear Notebook. Is expanding, but that's another part of the START negotiation, is to involve China in a bilateral negotiation with the US to limit their expansion. But the point is that lowering the US and Russia to a small number of warheads comparatively then opens up the possibility of eliminating all weapons by involving all of the nuclear armed states. What would be left when we get to 650 is no ICBMs, 40 bombs and air-launched cruise missiles, and 8 total Trident ballistic missiles with 16 missiles on board. And voila, that gets us to the minimum number of 500 deployed and 150 reserve. Again, this is a transition to complete elimination. And that's the hard part to get the commitment for, is, you know, when New START was ratified, we all thought, great, this is a stepping stone to further reductions back in 2010. Remember that? Well, what came out of that was a concrete, clear plan to maintain the New START levels forever. And all of the strategic programming that goes along with that was all based on maintaining that level forever. And we need to break that paradigm. New START's not just about warheads and launchers. The next START has to have that gold standard inspection and verification protocol. And again, over and over and over again, I can't overemphasize how important verification is. The third bullet there is really important. Right now, there's over 15,000 plutonium pits stored at the Pantex site in Texas from warheads that have been dismantled. But if you got a pit, you can build a new warhead. There was a project to convert the plutonium pits to a mixed oxide fuel to burn up in commercial reactors. It was terminated in 2018. $8 billion went into the project, and that many pits were dismantled. And currently that site is being rebuilt to produce new pits, which is insane. We have to call on the U.S. to terminate new pit production and commit to destroying all the old pits in storage, as well as pits that are removed from active warheads as they're dismantled. There's no reason to keep them. And finally, we have to talk to the Chinese. If we commit, we, the U.S. and Russia, commit to reducing our nuclear stockpiles, we need a commitment from China to stem its plans for expansion. We need to play the long game here. Because the final phase, once we, the U.S. and Russia, get down to that minimum deterrent level and have dismantled the non-deployed warheads, we're in a position to realistically enter negotiations under Article 6 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty with all 9 of the nuclear weapon states. And Article 6 states that we will pursue in good faith and bring to a conclusion negotiations leading to nuclear disarmament in all of its aspects under strict and effective international control. The treaty was ratified in 1969-70. It's still the holy grail of nuclear weapons treaties. The last NPT review conference was in August, and it was a shit show. Pardon my French, the U.S. and Russian delegations spent all the time pointing fingers over Ukraine. But I'm convinced that the NPT is a good treaty, and once the U.S. and Russia demonstrate a commitment to disarm, the other 7 nuclear weapon states will go along. And the ones that don't want to go along will be coerced to go along. Finally, we have the TPNW. It's a great treaty as well, except that it will remain incomplete until the 9 nuclear weapon states agree to disarm. And that doesn't diminish its importance. It is a milestone, and it is a shout out by the disenfranchised nations who don't have nuclear weapons, saying, we need you guys to get rid of those. And I think that if the U.S. commits to reducing their nuclear weapons stockpiles, the 27 NATO nations, as well as the Pacific allies, will have a place to go. And that place is the TPNW. And we've seen some interest by a few NATO nations and Australia to move in that direction. But again, the key is cooperative verification. The US and Russia have conducted hundreds of inspections, thousands of notifications over the years to verify what their deployed launchers and warheads are doing. Those gold standard inspections under the control of the United Nations are the only way that we can ensure compliance, but only if and only if the great powers commit to funding. One of the things that, I hear about is, well, we're going to have all this money that we can spend on social programs. Well, I'm telling you, the first 50% of the savings need to be spent on the dismantling, decommissioning, and verifications. And that's going to be for years. That's money well spent. And it's going to be a difficult sell to the Democratic Party that a large amount of money needs to be earmarked for nuclear weapons verification forever. Boom. It's that simple. Even an old sailor can figure that out. Peace is possible.
Very well.
And I'm going to stop share. And I'm going to sip some coffee. Thank you. Oh, thank you, Mary. And I'm open to any other questions or discussion for as long as you want.
So, Jane, go ahead.
Okay, well, first, thank you so much, Tom. That's really a lot of information, and I can see a lot of thought went into this. And maybe my question isn't your area of expertise, but I'm going to ask it anyway. So what would happen if the United States unilaterally disarmed, destroyed all the nuclear weapons, forget about inspections, forget about treaties, just get rid of them unilaterally? What would happen in the world?
Beats me. I don't know that that's a good plan. And I think it's a plan that the American people would not buy into. I have a very good friend who understands nuclear weapons. He was an Air Force launch officer, went through the Air Force Academy, became a launch control officer in a Minuteman silo. And when he found out what second strike really meant, and second strike really means killing everybody you can with every weapon you have, he became a conscientious objector and said, I will not do this, and left the Air Force. And now he's just a retired guy. But I say, hey, jump on. Aren't you opposed to nuclear weapons? And he says, well, I'm opposed to using nuclear weapons, but I am afraid that if we don't have nuclear weapons, somebody else will attack us or use those weapons to coerce the United States into doing whatever that other country wants done, or standing by. And I don't agree with that, but I think he speaks for a large majority of people who call themselves independents politically.
Well, thank you, and I'm pretty sure you're correct about the majority of the people, but that doesn't really get to the question I asked. What would happen if we got rid of all the nukes? And I think that we ought to be, everybody ought to be thinking about that.
That's a great question. Thank you.
Mary? You're muted, Mary.
You mean me?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank
Is it
you.
Mary Margaret, go ahead.
Okay. Did you have your hand up too, Mary? Oh, I'm sorry. Well, you go ahead. I defer to you.
I think that the only political reality that depresses the fill in the blank with the swear word out of me is that over the years, the people of the United States have become okay with using nuclear weapons, using the fact that we have nuclear weapons to coerce whoever to do whatever we want. But that when other countries, Russia, even hint at coercing us using nuclear weapons, we totally freak out and become right-wingers. So this is depressing, but I just kind of like to talk about depressing things just so that I feel like a normal human being, because this is the weight. The backpack that I wear is worn by everyone, and this weight is in it, whether we're thinking about it or not. That's the reality. The thing that for me works against it is that the countries that are sick and tired of what's going on with the Ukraine war, some like Brazil are actually trying to do something to get it to stop, are basically saying that the nuclear halves, or the US and Russia, whichever piece of this, have no right to threaten and kill everyone else. Those are the countries that are becoming part of the TPNW. You know, really progressive places like Paraguay feel like this. Paraguay is not a progressive place, but I'm just saying that the reality that we've got over 90 countries now signing on to the TPNW is interesting to me because it has that same logic that if the US continues to be coercive in its foreign policy, then those countries are saying, we can limit our economic cooperation with you until you start changing. Do you agree with that? Do you see that parallel there between those who are critical of our foreign policy and those who support the TPNW?
I'll say this. I think that's out of my wheelhouse. I'm just an old engineer and an old sailor who fears nuclear apocalypse and who understands that you can't control a nuclear war. And those that believe that, well, you know, if Russia uses tactical nuclear weapons in Europe, that's not going to cause escalation, are nuts. Yeah, I don't think we need to be coerced. I think we just need to get people to think about the consequences of having weapons that will destroy our world. And it's just that simple for me. and I trying to get different methodologies to get our government to think morally is we need to elect moral people to represent us in government. You've heard me say this before, but I remember Rick Larson up in Everett had a meeting with him some years ago, making points about nuclear weapons reductions and what it's costing us. And what he said was, the moral argument does not fly in Washington. It's all about the dollars. And, oh, by the way, he didn't say this, but I said it. Every one of you guys is bought and paid for. And your grandchildren are going to be paying for what you're spending right now.
Let's go to Mary Margaret, since she did have a question before, but go to reactions, folks, and raise your hand.
Okay. I was so glad to hear you say what I've been thinking for a long time, and not originally. Lots of people have been thinking this. If nobody was making money off of making weapons, nobody would be interested in waging war. But how do we do that? And the next and last question is, who are our friends? We think in the 43rd Legislative District that we have the tops: Patty Murray, Pramila Jayapal, and Cantwell. Yeah. And I realized that they are hawks in a way. At least I think Cantwell and Murray would be considered more hawkish than Jayapal. But do you know, who would you label our friends in Congress?
Well, like I said before, you're out of my wheelhouse. But it's clear to me, and has been clear to me for many years, that election finance reform is the root of this evil, or election finance, period, is the root of this evil. And election finance reform is the beginning of the way out of it, so that moral people can become leaders. And right now, that's just not the case. They're bought and paid for by the time they get there.
Thank you.
So, Bruce, I'm sorry, Bert first.
Okay. Tom, your chart showed the great disparity between tactical and strategic nuclear weapons, the imbalance between the United States and Russia, one side strongly inclined to tactical, the other side strongly inclined to strategic. How do you understand the thinking that the two sides, US and Russia, have for using those weapons? What
Well,
is the fly?
The distinction between tactical and strategic nuclear weapons is range. And the United States happens to be blessed with two oceans. So the continental United States cannot be attacked with tactical nuclear weapons. Whereas Russia sees their tactical nuclear weapons as defensive weapons to be used in Eastern Europe or against contiguous nations to them, like China, or to the U.S. Puppets in the Pacific, like South Korea and Japan. So it's really all about range. The U.S. has no use for tactical nuclear weapons. The only real tactical nuclear weapons the U.S. has are assigned to NATO. There's only 200 warheads. 100 of them are in Europe and are assigned to NATO, and they are gravity bombs that are going to be carried by the F-35. But again, it's really, the distinction is range and how you fight your war, and the good fortune that the United States has to have two oceans.
Thank you. Can I ask a follow-up question? Which is, does that imply that maybe the arguments I've been hearing that it has been a long-time strategy of the United States to force Russia into a position where the nuclear weapons they're afraid of are right on their border?
Well, that's part of you know, one of the things I'm hearing but not seeing is that Poland is building short-range ballistic missile silos, which, you know, threaten Russia with, you know, proxy weapons. There used to be short-range nuclear weapons owned by the U.S. and Turkey. Not anymore, but they were. So we need to get our nuclear weapons out of Europe. And the problem is our recourse to the Russian threat of nuclear weapons is to threaten Russia with our ballistic missiles, which is the escalation that is hard to resist. Again, I think that people who believe you can control a nuclear war are insane.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Bruce.
Well, Tom, again, thank you very much for your presentation and for all the time and energy that you put into thinking about this. I've got a number of questions in my head. I'll try to just limit. I'll start with, you had pointed out that we had, you know, the combined nuclear warheads on the planet was around 70,000 earlier in time, and now that it's down to 12,000. To me, that's a very encouraging and hopeful statistic to go against the despair that many people feel about nuclear weapons being just kind of like, oh, well, you know, they're here to stay, we can't get rid of them. That there was progress like that seems to me to be very hopeful. And while we are committed as Fellowship of Reconciliation and Ground Zero Center for Nonviolent Action, we are committed to unilateral disarmament because it's the right thing or the moral argument. We weren't making great progress with that particular framing of the issue. And it seems like when the nuclear freeze came along and reframed the issue of let's just stop on both sides, that was when there was a huge upswell of public protest in the early 1980s, with, you know, 1 million people hitting the streets of New York in '82, that then applied political pressure to a, you know, at least at that time, what seemed like a very right-wing president, Reagan, and led into ultimately the momentum for start treaty negotiations as a way to try to respond to that. So this again may be a question out of your wheelhouse, but I think that your design here of trying to frame the issue as unilateral, or, well, it's not unilateral, it's multilateral disarmament in stages, I think has the potential of political appeal and economic gains, you know, the guns versus butter thing. But how do you see this thing moving from discussion of a small group like us and in Ground Zero to something that's bigger and broader? And sort of tandem with that question is, we've got now what we didn't have in the 1980s. Nuclear weapons was the sole existential threat to the world. And now we're seeing climate change being the highest anxiety, highest polling numbers in terms of what people are fearing. Certainly younger people are very aware of climate change and almost non-existent on contemplating the threat from nuclear weapons. So how would you proceed going forward? How would you see the relationship to climate change as the other existential threat to humanity? You've got 30 seconds to answer that.
Oh, sure. The way I framed it is that the big leap is a bilateral agreement between the US and Russia to lower our stockpiles such that they're comparable with China.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time to convince China that that's what we're doing.
And I guess my question is more, how do you develop the political will in the United States? How do you develop the movement pressure that we had in the 80s to make even a right-wing administration start moving on the issue?
That's a harder nut to crack. And again, the entrenchment of the arms industry, the war-making industry, is just so scary and so discouraging. You know, how do we battle Lockheed Martin and Raytheon and General Dynamics? And I see Mary saying something, but it's Boeing. She said Boeing. Yes, all those guys.
Coming up with some form of show me the money kind of strategy politically is going to be, it sounds like it would be key in your mind.
You know, Bruce, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. I wish I did. But I'll tell you what, our generation is not going to do it. The current generation of leadership is not going to do it. Biden and Putin are not the heroes that are going to save the world.
Right.
It's the next generation. And I don't know who those guys are, who those people are.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if we could elect 2 women, they could probably get together and fix it all. But, you know, there's this testosterone problem, I think, that
The hormonal solution, yes.
you bet.
Tom, do you have time for one more question?
I got all night.
Okay, so John and Cindy, what?
This isn't so much a question as I wonder if you could write an op-ed for the New York Times or the Washington Post or even the Seattle Times, but and put your idea into that.
Yeah, that's on my current list of things to do. Right up there with starting to mow the lawn now that it's spring. But yeah, I have thought about trying to encapsulate this plan in a 1-page document, and I'm working on that. Thanks.
Well, I guess we have come sort of to the end of the time that we usually have for these presentations, and I can't thank you enough, Tom, for sharing your thoughts with us. And needless to say, if you do come up with this one idea that we can pursue, we're all ears.